The moment Nate Aldridge stood up from his table and walked toward the woman by the door, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. All he knew was that her little boy hadn't stopped staring at his plate of shepherd's pie for the past 4 minutes, and something about that look made it impossible to stay in his seat. But let's go back to the beginning. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of cold that sneaks up on you. The sky turning gray before 3 in the afternoon, the wind off. Lake Ontario cutting right through your jacket like it had somewhere important to be. Nate had worked a 10-hour shift at the shipping depot on the east side of Hamilton, sorting and stacking freight until his lower back had gone from an ache to something closer to a slow, persistent burn. He was 41 years old, and his body had started keeping score in ways it hadn't bothered to when he was 30. His daughter Rosie was 7. She had her mother's dark eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness, and she was waiting for him at after-school care, already in her coat and boots, backpack on, ready to go before he'd even buzzed in through the front door. "You're the last one again, Mr. Aldridge," the woman at the desk said with a tired but kind smile. "I know. I'm sorry." He said it every Tuesday. He meant it every time. Rosie didn't seem to mind. She took his hand as they walked to the truck, chattering about a girl named Brianna who could do a cartwheel in the gym and a book she was reading about a dog who solved mysteries. Nate listened and nodded and tried to let her voice crowd out the tiredness in his bones. They'd been on their own for 2 years. Her mother, Jess, hadn't left them in any dramatic way. No argument, no affair, no clean villain in the story. She'd just drifted, slowly at first and then all at once, into a life that didn't have much room for a kid with speech therapy appointments and a partner who came home smelling like a warehouse. She called Rosie on birthdays and at Christmas, and Nate was careful never to say a word against her because Rosie was 7. And she still loved her mom, and that was right and good, but it meant it was just the two of them in a 2-bedroom rental on the mountain, with one vehicle that needed new tires before the snow came, and a grocery budget that he tracked in a small notebook kept in his jacket pocket. They pulled into the parking lot of the Golden Griddle on Barton Street at 5:30. It was Rosie's reward for a good progress report. Her speech therapist had called Nate that afternoon to say that Rosie's consonant blends were coming along beautifully, and she'd said splash and string and strange without once having to slow down and restart. He'd almost cried in the middle of the depot floor, which would have been difficult to explain to his shift supervisor. "Can I get pancakes for dinner?" Rosie asked. "It's your night," Nate said. "Pancakes it is." The diner was nearly empty that early on a weeknight. Nate had been coming here for years. It was one of those places that hadn't changed in decades. The same brown vinyl booths, the same laminated menus, the same glass pie case spinning slowly by the register. The woman who brought their menus was named Connie, and she knew Nate well enough to bring his coffee without being asked. Rosie ordered chocolate chip pancakes. Nate got the shepherd's pie because it was the cheapest hot meal on the menu, $13, and because he was genuinely hungry in the deep, bone-level way you only get after a full day of physical work. He'd eaten a granola bar at 10 and half a sandwich at 2. The food came quickly. Rosie doused her pancakes in maple syrup with the focused dedication of a professional, and Nate dug into his shepherd's pie and felt, for the first time since 5 that morning, like everything might be okay. It was Rosie who noticed them first. "Daddy," she said, very quietly. She had a specific tone she used when she was trying not to be overheard, a soft, careful voice that she developed on her own, without anyone teaching her. "Look." He followed her gaze to the far end of the diner, near the door. A woman stood there, maybe 35, wearing a gray fleece jacket that wasn't quite heavy enough for the end of October. Her hair was in a low bun that had come half loose, and she had a canvas tote bag on one shoulder that looked full and heavy. Beside her, holding her hand with both of his, was a small boy, 4 years old, maybe just turned 5. He had a red raincoat and muddy sneakers and a stuffed rabbit tucked under his arm. The woman was talking to the cashier in a low voice. Nate couldn't hear the words, but he could read the situation easily enough. She was looking at the prices, doing the math, and the math wasn't working out. She smiled at the cashier, a tight, embarrassed smile, and shook her head slightly. Then she turned to the boy and crouched down to his level and said something soft and gentle into his ear. The boy nodded. He understood. He was 4 or 5 years old, and he already understood that sometimes you had to leave a warm place without eating. But before she straightened up, he looked back, just once, at the tables. His eyes moved across the room and landed, for a long moment, on Nate's shepherd's pie. It wasn't a greedy look. It wasn't the look of a child throwing a fit in a grocery store over cereal. It was something quieter and older than that. It was the look of a child who was hungry and had already learned not to say so. Nate had seen that look before. He'd seen it on Rosie's face, twice, stretch 18 months ago, when the truck needed an emergency transmission replacement, and he'd had to make their food last twice as long as it should have. 2 days of crackers and peanut butter and pasta with butter, and Rosie had sat at the kitchen table with that same exact look. Not complaining, not crying, just quietly watching the pot boil with enormous patient eyes. He'd sworn to himself that week that he would never let that happen to her again. He'd sold his guitar, his Xbox, and 3 boxes of tools he'd been keeping for a renovation he'd never gotten around to. He'd figured it out, but he'd never forgotten the look. He watched the woman take the boy's hand again and start toward the door. Nate was up before he'd made a conscious decision to stand. "Excuse me," he called, not loud, just enough. The woman went still. Her shoulders tightened in that particular way, the way people tighten when they're expecting something they won't like. She turned slowly. Up close, she had the kind of face that would be open and warm under different circumstances. There were shadows under her eyes, the gray-blue kind you get from not sleeping properly for too long, and a small scar on her chin that was probably decades old. She was holding herself very carefully, the way people hold themselves when they're trying not to let anyone see how tired they are. "Sorry," Nate said quickly. "I didn't mean to startle you. I just..." He paused, because there was no way to do this that didn't feel awkward, so he decided to just be direct. "I noticed your son looking at the food, and I wondered if you'd let me get you both something to eat." The woman blinked. Then the color rose in her face, swift and sharp, the unmistakable red of someone who has just been seen when they were trying very hard not to be. "We're fine," she said. Her voice was steady, but just barely. "Thank you." The little boy's stomach chose that exact moment to make its opinion known. A long, hollow rumble that cut through the quiet diner like a small announcement. Nobody moved. Rosie, who had been watching all of this with her fork still in her hand, carefully slid her plate toward the edge of the table. "He can have some of mine," she said matter-of-factly. "I'm pretty full." She had eaten less than a quarter of her pancakes. The woman pressed her lips together. Her eyes went bright with something she was working hard to hold back. "That's very sweet," she said. She was talking to Rosie, not Nate. "But we really can't." Nate understood. He understood it in a particular way that you understand something you felt yourself. Pride wasn't nothing. For a lot of people, especially people going through something they never expected to go through, pride was the thing that got them from one day to the next. The story they told themselves, "I am managing, I am handling it, I am okay," was sometimes the only solid ground they had, so he didn't push. Instead he looked at her and said, as simply as he could, "Then don't think of it as a favor. Think of it as 2 parents, on a rough night, sharing a meal. I've been on the other side of this, and I was glad when someone helped me." She looked at him for a long moment. Her son was watching her, and something in her face shifted, not collapsed, not surrendered, but shifted, the way ice shifts at the very end of winter when it's decided, finally that spring is coming anyway. "Okay," she said, very quietly. "Okay. Thank you." Her name was Vivian, but she asked him to call her Viv, almost immediately, the way Canadians do, that easy first-name shortcut that turns strangers into something else within the first 5 minutes. Her son was named Caspian, which she said, with a slight, self-deprecating smile. "I know," she said. "It's a lot of name for a small person. He goes by Cass." Cass had already climbed onto the bench seat across from Rosie and was introducing her to his stuffed rabbit, whose name was apparently Gerald. Rosie was listening to this information with complete seriousness, as though Gerald's backstory were important facts she needed to have. Nate flagged Connie down and ordered for Viv and Cass. Chicken strips and fries for Cass, a bowl of soup and a grilled cheese for Viv, and then sat back and let the evening settle into something unexpected. Viv wrapped both hands around her soup bowl when it came and closed her eyes for just a second, like the warmth of it was something she'd been waiting for without knowing it. Then she caught herself and looked up and almost apologized. Nate shook his head. "No need." She told him a little. Not everything, but enough. She'd moved to Hamilton from Sudbury just over a year ago, following a job at a logistics company that had seemed stable and turned out not to be. The company had restructured in the summer, and her position, along with 43 others, had disappeared in a single Friday afternoon email. She'd been looking since August. She'd been in the same apartment since the move, but her landlord had sold the building in September, and the new owners had decided to renovate and convert the units, which meant she and Cass had 30 days to find something else in one of the tightest rental markets she had ever encountered. The 30 days had run out 3 weeks ago. Since then they'd been staying with a woman from Viv's old job, Gwen, who had a spare room and had said, of course, stay as long as you need. But Gwen lived 40 minutes away and had her own kids and her own schedule. And Viv was acutely, painfully aware that she was a complication in someone else's life. I have a few interviews this week, she said. She was looking at the grilled cheese, cutting it into triangles the way you do when you're not quite ready to eat in front of someone. One of them looks really promising. Import coordinator role downtown. It's actually exactly what I've been doing for 8 years. That sounds good, Nate said. Yeah. She half smiled. I'm trying to stay in the that sounds good headspace about it instead of the what if it doesn't work out headspace. The second one's a deeper hole, Nate said. Much deeper, she agreed. Across the table, Cass had eaten his chicken strips with a focus and efficiency that was almost impressive. He'd slowed down a little toward the end of the fries. Not because he'd lost interest, but because Rosie had started teaching him a hand-clapping game, and his attention was now divided. He was a quiet kid, attentive, with those big steady eyes that some children have, the ones that make you feel like they're thinking something important that they haven't figured out how to say yet. Nate watched him for a moment. How old? He just turned 5 in September, Viv said. He's starting junior kindergarten in January, actually. He missed the September cutoff by 6 days. She smiled, and it was a real one this time, unguarded. He's been waiting like it's Christmas morning for the past 2 months. Rosie was like that, Nate said. She had her backpack packed a week early. Did she love it? School? She did. She does. She's got a bit of a speech thing we've been working on, but she's getting there. He paused. She said strength properly today, first try, no restart. That's what we were celebrating tonight. Viv looked at Rosie, who was now trying to teach Cass the hand-clapping game in reverse, giggling when he got it wrong. She seems like a great kid. She's the best thing I've ever done, Nate said simply. The way you say things that are so true they don't require decoration. When the bill came, Nate paid it without any ceremony. Viv started to say something. He could see her gearing up for it, and he just shook his head. Another time, he said, when things look different. She nodded. She understood the offer in that. Not charity, not pity, but a reasonable assumption that things would look different, that the current shape of her life was not its permanent shape. They were putting their coats on when Nate happened to glance out the window. The temperature had dropped since they'd come in. He could see it in the way the people on the sidewalk were moving, hunched and quick. And across the street, in the Tim Hortons parking lot, he could see an older model, Subaru, Outback with a cracked rear brake light, and what looked like the back seat packed with bags and a folded duvet. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the car. He looked at Cass, who was attempting to button his red raincoat and having trouble with the second button because Gerald the rabbit was still under his arm, and he refused to put him down. Rosie, who had been watching her father's face, touched his sleeve. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him in that particular way she had. Steady, patient, waiting to see what he was going to decide. He thought about Gwen's spare room 40 minutes away. He thought about a 5-year-old sleeping in a Subaru in late October in Ontario with a cracked brake light, wrapped in a duvet, waiting for January. Nate pulled on his jacket. Viv, he said, I'm going to ask you something and I want you to know that it comes from a completely straightforward place, not a weird one. He paused. Do you and Cass have somewhere solid to be tonight? She went quiet. Not the embarrassed quiet from earlier. A different kind, the quiet of someone deciding how honest to be. We'll be fine, she said. It was the same phrase she'd used at the door. He recognized it for what it was. Not a lie, exactly, but not quite the truth either. It was the phrase that meant I don't want to be a problem for you. There's a couch in my living room, Nate said. It's not fancy. Rosie used to sleep on it when she was sick and wanted to be near the TV. There's a bathroom down the hall, and I can find a spare blanket. It's warm and it's dry and it is absolutely, completely no trouble. He looked at her. You should say yes. Viv looked at him for a long time. Cass had finally given up on the second button and was just holding the coat closed with his rabbit hand. You don't know me, she said. No, Nate agreed. But I've got pretty good judgment about people. And Connie's known me for 6 years and she can vouch for me if that helps. He turned toward the counter. Connie, am I a decent person? Connie, who had been pretending not to listen while very obviously listening, looked up from the register. He's one of the better ones, she said without missing a beat. Thing loosened in Viv's face, not all the way but enough. One night, she said finally. Just tonight, and we'll figure the rest out tomorrow. That's all I'm offering, Nate said. One night. Outside, the cold hit them cleanly. That particular Ontario October, cold that smells like dead leaves and rain, and the first edge of something harder coming. Nate helped Cass with his coat button while Viv retrieved a duffel bag and a backpack from the Subaru, and locked it up carefully, as though it were still home and deserved the respect of being locked. The four of them walked to Nate's truck. Cass fell asleep within 10 minutes of getting in, his cheek against the window, Gerald still tucked under his arm. Rosie was asleep before they hit Barton Street. In the front, Nate and Viv didn't talk much. There wasn't a need to. Outside the windows, Hamilton scrolled past in the particular way it does at night. The older neighborhoods with their deep porches and big maples, the corner stores with their lights on, the streets that have been there long enough to feel lived in, genuinely and imperfectly lived in, by real people with real problems and real ordinary moments of kindness. At home, Nate set Cass up on the couch with blankets and a pillow from the hall closet. The boy didn't wake up. Viv sat in the armchair for a moment after he was settled and looked at her son sleeping, and Nate saw her faced something he recognized. That particular mix of relief and grief and love that parents carry, the weight of knowing your child is okay right now, in this moment, and not quite being able to let go of all the moments when they weren't. He made tea without being asked, set it on the coffee table next to her and said good night. In the morning he made eggs. Rosie, who woke up first as always, found Cass sitting on the kitchen floor with Gerald, deeply invested in a Duplo set that Nate hadn't thought she played with anymore. She sat down next to him and started building without comment. Viv came in looking like she'd slept. Not perfectly, not 8 hours, but enough. She wrapped her hands around the mug of coffee Nate handed her and said, in a voice that was quieter than the night before, "Thank you." "I mean it, I know you do," he said. She had an interview that afternoon. The import coordinator role. She asked if she could leave Cass with Nate for a couple of hours, voice carefully neutral, giving him every opportunity to say no. That it was too much, that it wasn't part of what he'd offered. He said yes without hesitating. She nodded and looked away and blinked a few times. She was gone for 2 hours and 14 minutes. Nate and Cass and Rosie built a Duplo city, ate lunch, and watched 20 minutes of a nature documentary about penguins, before Cass fell asleep on the carpet with Gerald, his knees tucked up, looking impossibly small. Nate sat in the kitchen with his coffee and looked out the window at the maple. In the backyard. Half its leaves gone, the branches starting to show. He thought about the version of himself from 18 months ago, standing in a warehouse parking lot, calculating whether he could delay the truck repair one more week. He thought about the woman who'd been his depot manager at the time, who had quietly handed him an envelope with $200 cash and said, "I remember when I needed this, please pass it on when you can." He'd passed it on 4 times since then, in small ways. Maybe this was a 5th. When Viv came back, she was walking differently. Something had shifted in the set of her shoulders. Not solved, not finished, but lighter. "They offered me the position," she said. She stood in the front hallway still in her coat, as though she needed a moment before making it fully real. On the spot. "They said they'd been looking for 6 weeks and I had exactly the background they needed." She pressed her hand briefly against her mouth. "I start in 2 weeks. Nate felt something unclench in his chest that he hadn't realized was clenched. "That's great, Viv. That's really great." It wasn't a perfect ending, she said so herself, later, once Cass was awake and they were all at the table for an early dinner of the spaghetti Nate made on Thursday nights. She still needed housing. She still needed 2 weeks of income before the first paycheck. There were still 100 practical problems lined up like a to-do list that wasn't going to solve itself overnight. But a job was a direction. A job meant a landlord would return her calls. A job meant Cass would start school in January with a home address on the form. Nate drove them back to Gwen's that evening. Before Viv got out of the truck, she turned to him and said, "I've been trying to figure out the right thing to say to you since last night and I keep coming up short." "You don't owe me a speech," Nate said. "I know." She paused. "I just want you to know that I'm going to remember this. Not as something that happened to me. As something I'm going to try to do for somebody else when I can." He nodded. That was more than enough. In the back seat, Rosie had already said goodbye to Cass and given him a drawing she'd done at the kitchen table. A picture of Gerald the rabbit with extremely detailed eyebrows. Cass was holding it with both hands, carefully the way children hold things that matter. Nate watched Hamilton move past the windows and thought about what it meant to notice someone. Not fix them, not save them. Just notice them, and not look away, and act on the small ordinary thing you could actually do. The gap between seeing a problem and turning away from it is not always a dramatic one. Sometimes it is no wider than the space between staying in your seat and standing up. Rosie had her forehead against the passenger window, watching the streetlight streak past. "Dad," she said after a while. "Yeah? I think Cass is going to be okay." Nate glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "I think so too." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to watching the lights. And that for tonight was enough.